Good afternoon, and welcome to our New York Archives Magazine online speaker series. I'm Josie Madison, editor of New York Archives. Today, we are joined by Richard Comstock and Dr. Richard Barbuto for our program, Defending Gotham in 1814, Why New York City is Not the Home of the Star-Spangled Banner. Richard Comstock, Lieutenant Colonel retired, is a steward of the Archives Partnership Trust. He spent 4 years on active duty with the U.S. Army, which included tours of duty in Vietnam and Korea. Richard was also a member of the New York Army National Guard and retired in 1990 after having spent the last 4 years commanding the 1st Battalion, 258th Field Artillery. Richard was also a tax partner with Arthur Anderson, subsequently a partner at Deloitte, and finally was managing director tax at MBIA, where he retired in 2017. He currently consults on tax matters and is on the board of various not-for-profit organizations. Richard Barbuto is Professor Emeritus of Military History at the U.S. Army Command and General Staff College at Fort Leavenworth, Kansas. Richard is a graduate of West Point and served for 23 years on active duty as an armor officer. He is a 2-time Larry J. Hackman Research Residency Award recipient in 2006 and 2009, and author of War of 1812, Politics, Society, and Combat, also Niagara 1814, America Invades Canada, and Long Range Guns, Close Quarter Combat, the 3rd United States Artillery Regiment in the War of 1812. There will be a question and answer session at the end of the presentation. So for those of you who have joined us today, you can submit questions throughout the presentation using the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen, and we will try to get to as many of those as we can at the end of the presentation. And now I will pass it over to Richard Comstock.
Thank you very much, Josie. I'm honored to be able to discuss with Richard Barbuto another chapter in his excellent history, New York's War of 1812. When I was approached about doing another session and heard it was about the defense of New York City, or Gotham, I was really excited because my lineage comes through the Coast Artillery. My grandfather and father both were coast artillerymen, beginning in the 13th Regiment, which eventually was reorganized, and they became part of the 245th Coast Artillery, HD, which stood for Harbor Defense. And there were a number of different regiments up and down the East Coast, but the one that they were attached to or assigned to was part of the Harbor Defense in New York. So I grew up hearing all about Fort Hancock in New Jersey, Fort Tilden in Brooklyn, Fort Totten in Queens, Fort H.G. Wright in Fisher's Island, Castle Williams on Governor's Island, Castle Clinton on Manhattan, and I learned that Fort Wood, which was on Bedloe's Island, was also a defensive position and ultimately became home for Our Lady of the Harbor, the Statue of Liberty. Until I was much older, I failed to realize the significance of these forts, nor did I understand the breadth of their range from north to south, from Maine to Florida. There were coastal defenses, and these defenses really began very crudely in prior to the Revolution, where significant communities would defend themselves with earth and berm and wood defensive positions where they could fire upon anybody or any fleet or other enemy that might be coming to invade their particular turf. Obviously, as time went on, and particularly after the Revolution and after the War of 1812, the building of these fortresses became much more sophisticated, and as we're going to talk about, some very interesting people became involved in their construction. And the construction of a coastal defense fort is viewed by the local population, particularly in the time we're talking about, as a non-aggressive type of preparation for any event. It wasn't viewed as the same way as trying to raise an army, which obviously we know has had its difficulties throughout the time of not only the Revolution, but the War of 1812. But as an artilleryman myself, I appreciate greatly the role that the Coast Artillery has played from colonial times up until World War II. In fact, my father was stationed at Fort Hancock in New Jersey when we declared war on both Germany, Italy, and Japan. And I come to believe that it was our reaction and to a potential threat, and our establishment of these coastal defenses, particularly in the New York City area, that helped. Clearly, one of the factors that helped in keeping the British from launching any full-scale attack on the city. So with that, I'd like to kind of talk a little bit with Rich about some items that struck me as I read through his most excellent book. I think that in my introduction, I alluded to the fact that the British didn't attack New York City, and I'm certain there were several reasons for that, aside from just the coastal fortifications. And I would like to ask Rich if he could just sort of elaborate on that and tell us a little more about things that might have also influenced the British decision.
Richard, good question. I've not been able to find any documentation why Admiral Cochrane's decision to attack Baltimore and then to move on New Orleans rather than to attack New York City. However, here are some points. First, New York was ringed with forts and other fortifications and presented a much, much tougher nut to crack than in 1776. Second, the number of British troops and warships available in the fall of 1814 in Chesapeake Bay was believed to be sufficient to attack Baltimore, especially after Washington, D.C. had fallen so easily in August. More warships and troops were still en route to North America and would arrive in December, perhaps too late for an attack in the north. Third, New Orleans was perceived as a more valuable target. The British could raid New York and perhaps burn it, but they could not hold it. They believed that it would be easier to attack and maintain the city of New Orleans, and this would give them a chokehold on the rich river traffic of the Mississippi. So those are my thoughts on why New York ultimately was not attacked by the British.
So it was clearly more than just simply those good coast artillerymen who were out there defending New York that kept the British at bay.
Well, I'm sure that was the major factor.
In reading not only your book, but anything else that other books that I've read on that touch on the War of 1812, I continue to be fascinated by the structure of the military organization. And as a former active duty officer, as well as a National Guardsman, I'm fascinated by the interaction that took place and the three structures, if you will, of military organization and the difficulties that the interactions between those military services posed. And that's a consistent theme in your book. And I want to ask you, are the difficulties involved in managing these continuation of a problem that existed prior to the War of 1812, or was this a phenomenon that certainly cropped up during the war?
I see. Well, during the American Revolution, the states owned their militia in toto. The governors decided if and when they would call up the militia and to what level the militia would cooperate with federal forces in the state. While the governors were zealous in guarding their citizens and jealous of any control by the Continental Congress, as the war progressed, the governors increasingly showed a willingness to deploy their militia outside of their state and in support of major campaigns. Now, after the war, and in light of the new Constitution, Congress made several attempts to establish procedures to bring the militia into federal service more efficiently in the event of an emergency. The federal army was impossibly small and generally unable to pacify the frontiers and defend the coastal cities. The country needed an efficient militia. Congress and the War Department attempted to set up rules to establish responsibilities, but when the war began, there was countless instances in which the militia was slow to respond, and the federal army's efforts to feed and equip and arm and pay the militiamen that were brought into service were grossly inadequate. Still, the War of 1812 was a step forward from the Revolution in combining federal and state forces in securing the nation.
Interesting. I again, I noticed in as part of a National Guard organization, I know of our split responsibilities both to our governor and to our president, and so it's interesting that that sort of evolution started way back when. It wasn't just something that happened overnight. New York City obviously was an important city to us as Americans and to the British, simply because it was a center of commerce. But in your book, I think, and you might want to talk a little bit more about this, that New York was also a link to what was going on upstate as well. I mean, the Hudson River was certainly a major artery that was capable of taking goods north. And again, a lot of the focus was north, as we talked about in our last webcast. And I think that it obviously there was no Erie Canal at that point in time, but I think that isn't it fair to say that New York was more than just an important city because of its population and because of the commerce going out?
Well, yeah, New York City was indeed a strategic link with the war-fighting fronts that extended from the Niagara River, the shores of Lake Ontario, and up into the St. Lawrence River, where the fighting was frequent and heavy. Virtually all supplies, weapons, cannon, ammunition originated or passed through New York City. Virtually all supplies, weapons, cannon, ammunition to supply the Navy had to come again through New York City. Anchors, iron fittings, sails, cables, ropes, cannon. So small boats were moving up and down the Hudson and the Mohawk rivers and every other waterway to bring the war material to the front.
Yeah, and it was clear that it was much more than just a commercial center for outgoing traffic. It was a pipeline to the north, and clearly, as we saw, as I said before, a lot of the action was up in the north. Staying with New York City? Is it fair to say that there was a significant concern about the fate of New York City as the war began and progressed, given the experience that New York had with regard during the Revolutionary War?
Yeah, well, New York City suffered considerably during the Revolution. During the Revolution, the British attacked New York City in 1776, and after a fierce campaign, they forced George Washington to withdraw from the city. The British then occupied New York City for 7 years and only departed when the war was over. They took hundreds of loyalists with them, settling them in the Caribbean or in Canada. While they occupied the city, there were 2 major fires, leaving about a third of the city in ruins. Since the British had seized the city in 1776, it appeared to many New Yorkers in 1812 that they could do it again. This is a good departure point. I'm going to call up some slides. Let's talk a little bit about New York City and the demographics of the time. In 1810, the US population was over 7 million, and almost 1 million people lived in the state of New York. New York City had almost 100,000 people, largest in the nation, and Philadelphia was the second largest city, and Baltimore was the third largest city. Now, it's Washington Irving who gave New York City the name of Gotham, tongue in cheek, because that is Old English for where goats are kept. So a bit of a disparaging remark, I believe. And then he originated the name Diedrich Knickerbocker, and that name stuck. For the longest time, Knickerbockers referred to the upper crust of New York City society, and eventually all New Yorkers were known as Knickerbockers. And of course, today that name continues on with the New York Knicks. So Washington Irving has a great cultural impact on the city. In 1806, His Majesty's ship Leander outside of New York City is stopping merchant vessels leaving the bay to see if they're carrying contraband. It fires a shot across the bow of a New York ship, unfortunately killing the pilot of the vessel. New Yorkers are just frantic with the loss of sovereignty, if you will, that Britain is right off their city, killing their citizens. And they make a call for war to the president, but Jefferson disregards that call of war because while that incident was terrible, it didn't inflame the rest of the nation, and Jefferson knew the nation was just not ready for war. Enter Daniel Tompkins, a graduate of Columbia College. He's born in a farm near Scarsdale. He's elected governor. Tompkins is the first governor of New York who's not part of the New York aristocracy. Now, in 1807, a year after the Leander affair, the Chesapeake affair, here a British warship fires on an American warship, which is forced to strike its colors, to surrender. And again, now there's a national uproar for war, and Jefferson once again knows that the country's not ready for war, and he does not heed that plea for war. But Tompkins realizes at this point that war is very likely. And New York State has got over 400 miles of a shared border with Canada. So Tompkins had to protect that border, the people living on the border, as well as the people in New York City. So one of the first things that happens is he forms, with DeWitt Clinton as the chair, a state board of fortification to start a building program. And a group of people, the Vice President George Clinton, who's a New Yorker, the Secretary of War Dearborn, and Colonel Jonathan Williams, who's the chief engineer of the Army, they get together, do a survey of New York Harbor, and they come up with a building plan. This is the blueprint. It's called the Outline of a Plan of Defense for the City and the Harbor of New York. And Tompkins and DeWitt Clinton, mayor of the city, implement that plan. Enter Robert Fulton. Robert Fulton, the inventor and the painter, had spent 20 years in Europe, and he returns about the time of the Leander affair. And we know him because he invented the successful steamship, the Clermont. Of course, he called it the North River Steamboat, not the Clermont. But Fulton did a tremendous amount of work in naval warfare. In the upper right-hand corner, you see a submarine. Fulton invented that. It was successful. It could stay submerged in 20 feet of water for 24 hours, and it can move fairly well under the water. He also worked on torpedo boats. He built submerged mines that worked. When he returned to New York, he offered these to the Navy, which tested them and found them to be successful. Now, in Tompkins' buildup and preparation for the war, the city expanded its arsenal. An arsenal is a building where you store weapons and ammunition. The state built an arsenal and started bringing weapons into the city. There are 2 federal arsenals established in the city with more muskets and more field guns to prepare the city. The city is filled with regular soldiers, volunteers from the state of New York, the state militia, and the detached militia. Now, the detached militia are like Minutemen. They are designated. They know that they are ready to be called up next if the militia is called up. They have all their equipment with them. They know where and when to go. So they're really ready to march at a moment's notice. The Navy expands its naval yard on the Lower East Side, and the state owns upwards on 80 heavy guns to move into these fortifications, and it's going to expand that number by 1812. Now, how did the British get into New York City? Well, three ways of doing it. Follow the red arrows. This is what they did during the American Revolution. They landed the army in Staten Island. They crossed the Narrows. This is the Verrazano Narrows, where the Verrazano bridges are located now. It's about a mile wide. Landed in Long Island. They passed over Brooklyn Heights, seized the village then of Brooklyn, and ultimately landed on Manhattan. The second way to New York City would be a straight naval attack straight through the Narrows. And Royal Navy vessels would come as close to the city as they could. You know, they can fire a mile and a half away, and their shot could start fires in New York City. That would be a raid, but it would be very damaging. And the third way is to sneak through Long Island Sound. Now, if you do this, you have to pass through Hellgate. So these are the three ways that the city, the governor, the mayor, the army engineers had to figure out how to block to keep the British from being able to do any of these routes into the city. Well, enter Jonathan Williams. He's the chief engineer. In 1807, he starts working on these various forts. You see the forts there that are going to be built to guard the Narrows. The forts on Staten Island are owned by the state. The federal government is supposed to build one across the Narrows. There's a fort going up protecting any passage through Hellgate. But Williams runs into a problem, if you will, with the regular army officers who work for him. They didn't want to work for him. He resigns his commission, but he's immediately hired by New York State to continue doing the building. So instead of being a representative of the federal government, he's now working directly for the state. Now, here are the forts that guard the Narrows. Now, in this painting here, you're standing in the foreground on Long Island, and you're looking across to Staten Island. Now, these forts that you see on Staten Island are not what they look like in 1812. They were a little less impressive then. But you've got guns right at a water level. And above that, on the high ground, you have another fort that protects the lower fort from a land attack. So this is a very serious fortification that the British would have to bypass. However, when the war starts, there are no guns on the Long Island Sound. They'll be added while the war's ongoing. Now, Williams is replaced by Joseph Gardner Swift, first graduate of West Point. He has a meteoric career. He's a full colonel just a few years after, 10 years after graduation. He starts work on designing and building the forts that are on the harbor islands. These are federal responsibility. The forts on Staten Island belong to New York, but on Governor's Island, Bedloe's Island, which is now Liberty Island, and Ellis Island, fortifications are going up to be manned by federal troops. Also notice in Long Island, you see where the village of Brooklyn is. The dotted line anchored by Fort Greene today is Prospect Park. In the Revolution, the British came across the heights here and ended up in the village of Brooklyn. So he starts building a lot of fortifications, earthen fortifications for the most part, connecting to Fort Greene, which is a masonry fort. And you can see there that Fort Stevens and Fort Clinton guarding the entrance of Long Island Sound into the East River. And in 1814, Swift's appointed a brevet brigadier general, because engineers in those days could not be brigadier generals. They could only be, colonel was their highest rank. But based on his work, he was breveted. So he wore stars from that point on. Now, here's the forts. We've got Castle Williams built on Governor's Island. That's the upper fortress there. It's a casemate fort. Circular. A casemate is a room, and each of these rooms has 2 gun ports in it. So these are a number of gun ports. Of course, this structure still exists on Governor's Island. And the Castle Clinton was in those days called the Southwest Battery. It's in Battery Park today. with a single level of casemate gun ports. Now, everything you see in green in that lower right picture, Battery Park, that was all water in 1812. What they had done is created an artificial island to be the base of Castle Clinton, and they built a fort on it, and it had a causeway leading from the city out to the fort. After the war, this is all filled in, and it is now Battery Park. Now, what's Madison's strategy to win this war? Well, he's got war aims. He wants to stop the British from seizing cargoes. He wants to stop the British from seizing sailors on American ships. And he wants the British to stop arming the Native Americans who are pushing back on white expansion into their lands. His strategy is this: he can't fight Britain in Europe, but he can invade and take Canada. He can seize Montreal and Quebec City. And so what he wants to do is to seize those two cities and then in negotiations, trade them back to Britain. Now, remember, Britain is embroiled in a existential war with France. And all of their resources are dedicated to fighting Napoleon. So what Madison hopes to do is to do this, to seize these cities quickly. Now, he also gives authorization to civilian merchants who want to arm their vessels. The ship is called a privateer, and license these privateers to seize only British cargoes. They're not pirates, they're legal. The British recognize these people as combatants, legal combatants. And what Madison hoped to do is to tear the guts out of the British merchant marine. That's not how it works out, but that's his plan for this war. Now, 1813 is a big year for New York City. The war had not been going well nationwide in 1812. So the federal government unifies under federal control all the defenses of New York City and its harbors and all of its waterways. So the regular Army commander who commands the 3rd Military District also has command of a bunch of New Jersey militia, as well as all the New York militia that reside in the New York City, Long Island area. They create a system of telegraph poles that link Staten Island with Castle Clinton, which is the headquarters of the 3rd Military District. So if any Royal Naval vessels are approaching the Verrazano Narrows, the word can flash back to the 3rd Military District, who can start calling up militia. The War Department establishes sea fencibles. These are sailors who are formed in a military unit. They man the gunboats guarding the harbor. They also are in some of the forts manning the artillery pieces. The federal government creates 2 regiments of volunteers. The volunteers sign up only for a year. They're not going to get the bonuses. They're not going to get land at the end of the war, but they're guaranteed that they will only serve in the New York City area. They will not be deployed for war against Canada. The Army adds 3 full regiments of regulars. This is over 2,000 troops that are stationed permanently in the fortresses around the city. Now, in April of 1813, the Royal Navy has enough warships to blockade permanently New York City and to support any attack if it's going to happen. And now the Navy buys the plans for Fulton's warship, his steam warship, and they start building that. Here's the warship when it's done, and it will actually get launched in 1814. It's the world's first large successful steam warship. Fulton calls it the Demologos, the word of the people. However, the Navy calls it Fulton the First. It's got its paddle wheel in the center of the ship, which is protected. The hull is protected by 5-foot thick oak walls. So it's unlikely that any artillery fire from British warships are going to penetrate through it. It can move, and being steam powered, it can move when there's no wind. So if the British are in the harbor and the wind is variable or light winds, The steamboat can move, but the warships cannot. So potentially, this is really a formidable weapon system. Now, 1814 comes along, Napoleon is defeated, and all of a sudden, the British have tens of thousands of trained, experienced troops. Hundreds of warships, big warships, are available for action of the war in America. And the British people are crying to the ministry for vengeance, because as far as the British population was concerned, is they are making all these sacrifices for all these years to defend the world from the ogre Napoleon. Napoleon's gone. America stabbed Britain in the back while Britain was carrying on the war against Napoleon. This calls for vengeance. The Americans are totally aware that this is happening. They're getting the newspapers. They're reading all the rumors about huge forces of British soldiers and the Royal Navy heading across the Atlantic. The rumors are true, but they're varied. They don't know what the target is, but every major city on the Atlantic coast has got to be prepared for attack. The man who controls the Royal Navy in the Western Atlantic is Alexander Cochrane. He hates Americans. In this quote I'll read to you that he wrote at the time. "I have it much at heart to give them, the Americans, a complete drubbing before peace is made, when I trust their northern limits will be circumscribed and the command of the Mississippi wrested from them. He wants to move the border of Canada southward, and he wants to grab New Orleans to control all the river traffic." So he's out for vengeance as well. He's a very capable admiral. Now, the Empire strikes in August and September of 1814, burn Washington. They occupy much of the coast of Maine, fully intending on taking northern Maine and giving it to Canada. But over a 7-day period, the Americans counterattack and actually stop this initial onslaught, the onslaught that opened up in August. There's a Battle of Plattsburgh, where Plattsburgh is saved. There's the defense of Baltimore, where they turn back a Royal Navy squadron and defend the city against land attack. And finally, most people aren't tracking this one, but there's a whole division of American troops, over 2,000, in Fort Erie, which is in Canada, directly across from Buffalo. They're trapped there. They're surrounded by the British. There's no way out. If the British can break into the Fort Erie defenses, there's no boats that can carry 2,000 Americans across the Niagara River into Buffalo, and the Americans know that. Well, in September, the American division breaks out of Fort Erie, and they raise the siege, and they'll stay in Canada until November. So over this 1 week, I call it a miracle that they've got these 3 victories in a row. So New York City is in crisis. Colonel Marinus Willett, who is a former general in the American Revolution, very successful. He's a war hero, gets appointed mayor of New York City. He gives speeches in New York City. And here's an extract from one of his speeches. 58 years are now past since I was a witness of press gangs traversing these streets, dragging men from their houses on board British ships of war. He's reminding the New Yorkers how bad the revolution was. He ends his speeches with a toast that was very common during the American Revolution. So it resonates with the people. May every citizen be a soldier and every soldier a citizen. So what's in the New York City? What's the mood in New York City? It's one of preparation. The Army needs people to dig trenches, and the folks in New York in large groups get on steamboats to ferry across to Brooklyn. They walk up to the Brooklyn Heights. They spend the days digging trenches, throwing up parapets, and they do this week after week after week. Governor Tompkins calls up these Minutemen, 3,000 detached militia, largely from along the shores of the Hudson River all the way up to Albany. And he calls them for service into New York City directly. So at the time of the crisis, 17,000 armed militia are in New York City. 4,000 to 5,000 regular troops are in New York City. And basically in the city, 1 out of 4 people you would see on the street is in uniform. Now, interestingly enough, the President Madison, gives Governor Tompkins command of the 3rd Military District. So now Tompkins, a civilian, can give orders to all the federal troops, all the state troops, including a large number of New Jersey militia. So he can coordinate the defense. And by now there are hundreds of heavy guns in all these fortifications that have been built, protecting the city. Now, negotiations are ongoing in Ghent, in Europe, and the British have their initial demands. One of them is to create an Indian buffer state of all the land north of the Ohio River. So Michigan, Indiana, Illinois Territory, the state of Ohio. When the war is over, they're going to give that to the Indians and the British will administer it, but the Americans will be out. Also, they want to remove all the naval forces, American naval forces, from the Great Lakes and remove all of their fortifications on the shores of the Great Lakes. The Americans can't accept that. They refuse those terms. They send back for instructions at the State Department back in Washington to ask them where they want to go. But negotiations are ongoing. Now, the British want to end this war. They want to win this war. And they take their greatest general, the Duke of Wellington, they offer him command. Wellington says, if you want me to go, I'll go. But here's the problem. We're not going to lose this war, but we can't win it either until we control the Great Lakes and Lake Champlain. And the Americans have won the Battle of Lake Erie. They've won the Battle of Plattsburgh. We're no closer to taking Lake Ontario. So it's going to take us a year longer to do that. Now, he also tells the ministry, you really have no right to ask for the land north of the Ohio River. You have hardly any British troops in territory belonging to the United States, Northern Maine being the exception. Therefore, Wellington tells them, unless you want this war to go into 1815 and maybe 1816, make peace now. The ministry hears this from Wellington. They respect him. They listen carefully to the people and other politicians. They decide to make peace. And therefore, on Christmas Eve in 1814 in Ghent, they water down all their demands. They have something that's acceptable to the American negotiators. They sign a peace. Now, America won't find out about the peace treaty until February, when the treaty itself gets back to Washington, D.C. To be ratified by the Senate. So this pretty well ends the story. New York City has survived for a number of reasons, largely the dedication of the people and the commitment of Governor Tompkins, and to a lesser extent, perhaps DeWitt Clinton. So that ends the slideshow of how this all went down in 1814. And now I'm going to take this opportunity for a very shameless advertisement for my book. 3 chapters of this book are dedicated to the defense of New York City. It's a 19-chapter book. You can get it from Amazon Books. It's also available Barnes & Noble. You can go directly to Oklahoma University Press. In all of these places, if you do a search for Barbuto, this book will pop out on Amazon. I've got an author's page, so my other books will appear there. This book in particular has just gone to soft cover, which lessens the expense of it all. So anyway, with that advertisement, I'm going to turn this program back over to you, Richard.
Thank you, Rich. It was great, and we all learn something every time we go through this. Um, I want to go back to Tompkins, and clearly, from my perspective, being an upstate New Yorker, I'm most interested in him. He not only fought a non-U.S. foe, or managed the fight against a non-U.S. foe. He also had I would say, a fairly dicey internal struggle politically with his foes, his Federalist foes, if you will. But in spite of all that, he managed procurement of manpower, supplies, arms, and finances with varying degrees of success, of course. But after the war, interestingly enough, he went on to have a role in national politics, and subsequent to that, he had his own ups and during that and subsequent to that, he had his own ups and downs. And could you tell us more about Tompkins post-war?
Oh, sure. Well, Tompkins is the unsung hero of the defense of the entire state as well as New York City. After the war, he resigns his governorship after being elected vice president on the ticket with James Monroe. Tompkins had been thrown from his horse while inspecting the defenses around Brooklyn. He never fully recovered from his injuries. His political enemies, as you mentioned, discovered that Tompkins did not have satisfactory receipts to cover more than $100,000 in disbursements that Tompkins had personally made during the war. The Assembly and the Senate stepped in and declared that many of Tompkins' receipts were indeed irregular. However, given his reputation and the circumstances of weak accounting during the war, these legislative bodies voted to settle the irregularities in Tompkins' favor. Now, in the midst of that financial scandal is a gubernatorial election. Tompkins runs for governor, but this time he loses to DeWitt Clinton. Now then, the federal government charges him with irregular handling of disbursements of federal money. The accounting of this new scandal just dragged on for years. Now, eventually Congress, referring to his patriotism, his honesty, and the fact that he had supported the war effort with his personal fortune, they settled the accounts in Tompkins' favor. But the accounting mess was hard on the vice president, and he descended further into alcoholic dependency. Now, just 3 months after he completed 8 years as vice president, Tompkins passes away at the age of 50. Unfortunately, Tompkins is a forgotten man today, but in his time, he was a selfless patriot and exactly the leader that New York needed during the war.
That's why I'm now a proud upstate New Yorker from Tompkins County, clearly. Moving on to privateering, and you did speak of it, and I'm most interested in it. I read a book on pirates not long ago, in which I learned that Blackbeard, before he became a pirate, was a privateer, and the difference between pirates and privateers was only one of spelling. But nonetheless, I think that what I found interesting in your book was that you described one privateer who was given command as a commodore of gunboats in and around New York City, which I thought was very interesting. And I thought if you had anything else you wanted to talk about with regard to that, I'd love to hear.
Privateering is a fascinating topic, isn't it?
Oh yeah.
Madison counted on privateering to damage British trade, at least enough to persuade Britain to come to the negotiating table. Privateering was entirely legal and gave permission for captains of civilian vessels to capture merchant vessels of the enemy. There were 44 successful privateers who called New York City their home port. These privateers, 44 of them, captured 401 British cargo ships. One ship, the Saratoga, captured 32 British merchant ships. However, the British shippers replaced Britain's merchant marine faster than American privateers could deplete it. A small flotilla of gunboats defended the waters around New York City, as you mentioned, anywhere between 40 and 50 of them. And they had crews of 40 to 60 sailors. The Department of the Navy commissioned a privateer, Jacob Lewis. He had been the former captain of the privateer Bunker Hill. They made him a master commandant, a naval rank, and gave him command of the gunboats with the honorific title of Commodore. And Commodore Lewis kept his gunboats actively engaged in protecting the coastal trade, which fed the citizens of New York City.
Fascinating stuff, and you're right. I mean, privateering is a subject and an interest all of its own. As a West Pointer, obviously, I know you're proud of the contribution, if you will, that the West Pointers made early on in the engineering of a lot of these defensive fortifications. I alluded to Fort Totten earlier. My dad was in the 20s or early 30s stationed at Fort Totten, and that was Joseph Totten, who was among the first graduates of West Point. But West Pointers did play a significant role as engineering expert with their engineering expertise in the development of a lot of these fortifications.
Well, West Point had been educating engineering officers since 1802, and Jonathan Williams and Joseph Gardner Swift drew heavily upon the graduates of West Point to assist them in superintending all the many projects associated with fortifying the city and its environs. Of West Point's 97 graduates who served during the war, 17 of them, all engineers, worked on the city's defenses. Prominent among these, as you alluded, was Joseph Totten, who graduated from West Point in 1805. Totten worked on defenses on the Niagara frontier, on Lake Champlain, as well as on Castle Clinton and Castle Williams in New York Harbor. After the war, he's appointed the chief engineer of the Army. He is co-founder of the National Academy of Sciences. Totten served in the Army right up to and into the American Civil War. And as you say, Fort Totten in Queens is named after Joseph Totten.
Yeah, hey, very interesting. Shifting gears a little bit, I had to put this in, and I apologize in advance, but as a current resident of Westchester County, Captain Lawrence is important to us as Westchester's own brewery. However, Captain Lawrence, as you point out in your book, certainly deserves more credit than simply being the inspiration for an excellent brewery in Westchester County. Not the least of which is "Don't give up the ship," which in his dying moments said to his next in command. Clearly, more credit should be given to Captain Lawrence than simply a standard bearer for a brewery.
Well, yeah. In 1813, Master Commandant James Lawrence, commanding the sloop Hornet, defeated His Majesty's sloop Peacock. And Lawrence was indeed a darling of New Yorkers because he maintained his household in the city. And the New York City Common Council recognized his achievement in this naval battle by granting him freedom of the city, and also held a very large dinner for him and his crew. The Navy Department then gave Lawrence command of the frigate Chesapeake. This is the same ship that had been damaged by the British in 1807. And as you say, Lawrence fell mortally wounded in the battle with His Majesty's ship Shannon in June of 1813. And as you say, as he's carried below deck, he tells his crew, "Don't give up the ship." Well, Lawrence's best friend was Oliver Hazard Perry, who's commanding the naval squadron on Lake Erie. Now, what Perry does is he takes this quote and he sews it in white letters on a massive blue flag, and he flies it from his flagship During the Battle of Lake Erie in September of 1813, so James Lawrence gives us a great quote, but he is very much a war hero, a naval hero in his own right.
Well, I'm proud of him, and so I'm sure the brewmasters in Westchester County. The British blockade, which you described in part as it related to New York City, I found interesting in your book that blockade was somewhat less onerous to the states of the New England states, the Massachusetts and clearly, as we discussed earlier in the last our last discussion in May, Massachusetts and some of the other states were not keen on participating in this, and I think that possibly the difference in how the British treated those states versus some of the other states that were more into the fray, so to speak, was important just to note.
Right. Well, in 1812, the Royal Navy is blockading those ports in Europe that are under French control. Blockade duty required virtually every British warship. Nonetheless, when 1813 arrives, the Royal Navy stretches its blockading effort to American ports. But the Admiralty very consciously avoided antagonizing New England because the Federalist governors and legislatures were withholding their support from the American war effort. The British strategy worked to some degree, and in 1814, New England politicians actually considered seceding from the Union in order to withdraw from the war. However, the war ended before New England states carried out the threatened secession.
Yeah, very, very interesting. And I think, we could go on and on, but I don't want to shortchange any of our participants from asking questions. And Josie, if you want to take questions, or I'm more than happy to mute myself out of this thing and simply enjoy the presentation. But before I go, let me say once again that how much I've enjoyed Rich's book, because we have to be careful. I'm a Richard and he's a Rich, but how much I've enjoyed Rich's book and find myself reading it over again. Different chapters that I'm particularly interested in, and some of my questions are geared towards the things that really, sort of caught my eye. But thank you for writing the book, and thank you for letting me be part of your presentation.
Well, thanks to you both for an excellent presentation. And we do have a couple of questions from the people who have joined us today. And we actually had a few about Robert Fulton, who was a fascinating character. And I was not actually aware that he was a painter on top of everything else, which is amazing. But one of our participants wondered if Fulton County in New York State is named after Robert Fulton. And somebody else wondered if Jules Verne named his submarine Nautilus after Fulton's submarine.
I think the answer to both those questions is yes. I can't verify that, but that was always my understanding. Fulton County and the Nautilus. Yes, that was my understanding too.
So we also have a couple of questions about records and where you would find information. So if people have, family members who may have participated in the War of 1812, or they just want to see some more records about people in their local area who may have participated, where are those records?
Well, certainly the State Archives has an awful lot of that material. Unfortunately, with the fire in the state capitol that destroyed many of the militia records, and an archivist in the past took the more mundane militia records and removed them to make room for other material. I've pulled up the records in preparing this book that you can still smell the smoke from the fire over a century ago. But I would certainly start at the archives. I'm surprised at how many county and city historical societies have their own collections of archives. I found things there that I don't think exist anywhere else. Buffalo has got a large collection of 1812 material in the Buffalo History Museum. I get things from there as well. So I think those are the places I would start.
And I guess just as a public service announcement, it's always a good idea to start with with a reference archivist or a reference librarian, and just ask. Those people can be very helpful in pointing you in the right direction for records. We also have, I think we have time for just one more question. One guest asked, did the British ever attempt to approach New York City from the Long Island Sound?
Oh, good question. Excellent question. As a matter of fact, they put a major warship in Long Island Sound, not for the purpose of supporting an attack, but to interdict any traffic. They're trying to starve New York City, and they're trying to keep any of the local coastal traffic coming in or out. Interestingly, the Americans attempted to blow up that warship. And the commander of the warship is Thomas Hardy. And this is the fellow who was by Nelson's side at the Battle of Trafalgar. So, I mean, he's a top-notch British captain. Anyway, the Americans rigged this bomb in a small boat that looked like it was carrying cargo up and down the Sound. And they rigged it so that when you pulled on one of the last pieces of cargo, you would detonate the bomb. And they they grounded this this small boat. Sure enough, the British send out a ship's boat to investigate, and but as they're unloading cargo, now typically the cargo wouldn't have been loaded until you got to the warship. But as they're unloading the cargo, it goes up and it kills some of the British sailors that were attempting to shift cargo around. So yeah, there certainly was activity in Long Island Sound, but it was not an attempt to attack Manhattan Island.
For just, if I may interrupt it, the Fisher's Island, which is, if you get a map out, you can see this is way out off the eastern Connecticut, Rhode Island coastline, and that, I think, was built in anticipation of having something to defend the access point to Long Island Sound.
Great. Well, thanks so much to you both for a very engaging presentation today, and for helping us kick off our new season of online speaker series. And I want to thank everybody who joined us today. It's our privilege to make these events available to you and to keep New York State's history alive. If you're interested in the content we create and you'd like to see some more of it, please contact us at aptrust@nysed.gov, and you can receive a free past issue of New York Archives magazine. And also, please join us on October 18th at 12:30 for our next New York Archives magazine online speaker series entitled, "Who Owns a Photo of Your Face? The Right to Privacy and the Courts." This session will explore the 1902 landmark decision, Roberson versus Rochester Folding Box Company. The Roberson case explores privacy issues that reverberate today and illustrates the powerful role of the courts in our lives. This event is co-sponsored by the Historical Society of the New York Courts. If you would like to register for this program or to find out more about events that we are holding, please visit our website at www.nysarchivestrust.org. And thanks again to Richard Comstock and Rich Barbuto for joining us today. And thanks to everybody out there who also joined us. I hope you have a great day.
Thank you.